And first of all, welcome everybody. Good evening or morning, depending on where in the world you are joining us from. I'd like to wish you all a warm welcome to a seminar by Katherine Butler Schofield, hosted by the Centre for Early Modern Studies at the ANU. And a special thanks indeed to Katherine, who's kindly started her day early to be here with us. My name is Julie Hodgson. I'm from the School of History in the Research School of Social Science, and I am joined by my co-host, McComas Taylor, who is a reader in Sanskrit in the College of Asia and the Pacific, and who'll be moderating tonight's discussion. Firstly, I'd like to begin by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose lands we're meeting, in person and virtually, wherever you may be joining us from. Here in Canberra, the seminar is being held on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend a warm welcome to any First Nations people who may be joining us. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Centre, we're a community of humanities scholars who teach and research in various fields across the long early modern period. Our members are drawn from art history and design, languages and literature, theatre and performance studies, history and digital humanities. We'll have an opportunity to discuss Katherine's paper with her after her presentation. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so via the Q&A function or raise your virtual hand via Zoom and we can unmute you. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Katherine is a historian of music and listening in Mughal India and the para-colonial Indian Ocean in the long 18th century. She's senior lecturer in South Asian music and history in the music department at King's College London, where she is also head of music. She's published across a range of topics, including the intersections between music, emotions, aesthetics and ethics, performance cultures at Mughal courts, empires and the para-colonial, and musicians at risk. Her books include Monsoon Feelings, A History of Emotions in the Rain, a title I love, Tellings and Texts, Music, Literature and Performance in North India, and in what is very exciting news, her monograph, Music and Musicians in Late Mughal India, Histories of the Ephemeral, 1748 to 1858, will be available, I believe, from Friday via CUP. Today, Katherine will lead us into the musical world of Mughal India and touch on themes that remain highly relevant today as musicians and musical cultures are torn apart by violence. She's going to be speaking about the scattering of Shahjahanabad, Indian musicians' lives in a time of crisis, 1739 to 88. A warm welcome to Katherine.
Thank you so much. So I've lived and worked in the United Kingdom for the past quarter of a century, but I was fortunate to be born on Turrbal country in what is now southeast Queensland. So as an Australian woman of white settler background, I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I was born and raised, the Turrbal people and the Gubbi Gubbi people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Australians First Nations who are here present today. So I'm going to share my screen. The year was 1753. 5 years had passed since Muhammad Shah, who reigned from 1719 to 48, the last of the Mughal emperors to hold any real power, had died. Sitting at home in Panipat, just north of Delhi, Inayat Khan Rasikh had just finished putting the final touches to his latest literary work. It was, he thought, something entirely new in Hindustan. Given the rave reception of the first ever biographies of Urdu poets that had just stormed through the Delhi salons, he thought it would prove popular. He hoped it would, for times were uncertain in Shahjahanabad, Delhi, the capital of the Mughal Empire. The urbane residents of this cosmopolitan city had shrugged off the 1739 invasion of the Persian Emperor Nadir Shah with sang-froid, his attempted massacre of Delhi's population notwithstanding. The 1730s and 40s burst with new cultural life, with waves of innovation in Urdu poetry, musical composition, and painting, enrapturing audiences on a daily basis in Delhi's select salons. This was the golden age of poets Mir and Soda, of musicians Sadarang and Adarang, of courtesan Nur Bai, and of Taqi Bhagat, of painters Kalyan Das and Mir Kalan Khan. But Nadir Shah's incursion had exposed for all to see the threadbare nature of the Mughal emperor's new clothes. By the 1730s, the resurgent Marathas had already diverted the rivers of revenue from central India that had once poured into Mughal coffers. Nadir Shah may have torn away the best of the Mughal treasures, but it was his stripping of Muhammad Shah's dignity that triggered the Mughals' own provincial viceroys in Hyderabad, Awadh, and Bengal likewise to look to their own interests. From 1739, they no longer remitted taxes back to the centre. The denizens of Delhi kept calm and largely carried on, at least until Muhammad Shah's death. But it wasn't long before the effects of this disappearing revenue made themselves felt keenly in the pockets, indeed the very bones, of Delhi's cultivated elites. Rasikh was born in India in 1701 and came from a wealthy Persian family with a tradition of loyal service to the Mughal throne. He, his father, and his 5 brothers were all trusted and intimate favourites during Muhammad Shah's reign, and Mughal favour continued after 1748 under the young emperor Ahmad Shah. But in the end, they too watched helplessly as the Marathas commandeered and camped all over their beautiful orchards, fields, and gardens before the 1761 Battle of Panipat, and lost everything but the clothes they stood up in after the battle, as Ahmad Shah Abdali's victorious army swarmed through their lands like locusts. Yet, in 1753, Inayat Khan Rasikh sat down amidst the shady orchards and fruitful gardens of his family estate and put the finishing touches to his latest literary work, the Risale-i Zikr-i Mughaniyan-i Hindustani Bahisht Nashin, the first ever tazkira or biographical dictionaries of the lives of the late blessed musicians of Hindustan. 10 years later, Rasikh's tazkira appeared again as an unmarked section of a music treatise written for another Mughal emperor, Shah Alam II, who reigned from 1759 to 1806. The Khulasa al-Eshi Alam Shahi, or Shah Alam's quintessence of pleasure. It's a little uncertain who wrote it. The likely author's father was Roshan-ud-Dawla Zafar Khan Bahadur Rustam Jang Bakshi-ul-Mulk. I know, it's a mouthful. Paymaster General and favourite of Emperor Muhammad Shah in the 20s and 30s. It was his son, Nawab Mazhar Khan, who wrote the first Khulasa al-Esh in 1764. But the version I'm interested in was written in 1798 in Lucknow. Mazhar is again credited as its author, and Shah Alam its ultimate dedicatee, but the humble narrator of the 1798 version says he contributed substantially to the writing of this book, adding fine things that were approved by my respected uncle. Was this version then reworked by someone other than Mazhar? In 1803, a major notable of Shah Alam's court instead named the author as the famous hereditary musician Khushal Khan Anup Kalawant. Anup was a child in 1764 and firmly fixed at the court of Hyderabad long before 1790. But this confusion is understandable, for Anup did indeed write a Persian treatise for the Nizam, dated 1808, the Rag Darshan, or Vision of Rag, that is similar to the Khulasa al-Esh. Apart from their introductions, the 1798 Khulasa and Anup's Rag Darshan are both, in large part, copies of Mirza Khan's hugely influential 1675 treatise on Hindustani music, chapter 5 of the Tofat al-Hind, or Gift of India. The main point of diversion is the insertion into the middle of the Khulasat of Rasikh's tazkira, or biography of musicians. Mazhar and Rasikh both lived in Panipat, and the families were friends. So it's not surprising that Mazhar would know and admire Rasikh's monument to the late great musicians of Hindustan. Nor was he the only later writer on music to draw heavily from it in compiling his own new work of scholarship, as we shall see. The question is why? Why had life histories become so necessary to writing authoritatively on music in late Mughal India that the Tofat al-Hind, of all things, had to be plumped up with new material? The introductions of the 1798 Khulasat and the Rag Darshan share one particularly striking thing, an obsession with names and connecting them, with distinguished individuals, with genealogies, with memorializing the names of the dead and the great in the generally somewhat biased and selective view of the authors. And they were particularly concerned to somehow connect the separated Delhi, Lucknow, and Hyderabad courts of the present diminished age, circa 1800, quantifiably back to the court of Muhammad Shah, 1719 to 48, a time remembered in these texts with bittersweet nostalgia. Take, for example, the introductory section to Anoop's earliest version of the Rag Darshan, written in Hyderabad in Brajbhasha verse in 1800 and illustrated in 1804, somewhat crudely. Here, Anoop not only lists his genealogy, connecting the musical inheritance of his own lineage back to the greatest musician who ever lived, Tansen, who died in 1589, but illustrates it with this fabulous fantasy assembly, uniting the dead and the living in one magically charged musical assembly, or majlis. Tansen is there, of course, but he's joined by the two most famous musicians of Muhammad Shah's court, Niamat Khan Sadarang, playing the bean over his shoulder at the top right, and Firoz Khan Adarang in black, singing. Beneath Adarang is Khushal's father, Karim Khan, and right in the bottom corner, in the junior most spot, Khushal Khan Anoop himself. According to his 1808 Persian introduction, Anoop's father was the special disciple of Mian Adarang, who was himself the special disciple of the reigning prince of music, Mian Niamat Khan Sadarang, whose status in the science of music is brighter than the sun and goes without saying. Because of their eminence in this unique science, they were honored attendants upon the late Emperor Muhammad Shah. But due to the changing fortunes of the time and the collapse of the Sultanate, Khushal Khan, with the late Karim Khan, came to Hyderabad. 60 years separated the death of Muhammad Shah and the composition of these lines. Why recall Muhammad Shah's court, but list literally nothing of the intervening years? The introduction of the 1798 Khulasat wallows even more deeply in the sea of nostalgia, as Bakshi-ul-Mulk, Mazhar Khan's music-loving father, Roshan-ud-Dawla, was responsible for introducing all musicians to Muhammad Shah's court and for paying them. Roshan-ud-Dawla spent 2 million rupees on creating musical pleasure at Muhammad Shah's court, thus personally bringing into being, quote, the entire realm of music lovers and beloved musicians, all of them unsurpassed in their time. And here follows a very long quotation, so hold your breath. All of the Kalawans perfect in this art and the most accomplished of the time entered Muhammad Shah's service and earned thousands for song and vocal improvisations. The masters of the Kalawans means artists, Mian Anjabaraz Khan and Firoz Khan Adarang, came frequently to the Blessed Court, received purses of gold for their steadfast friendship, brought everyone together through the conviviality and sincerity of their gatherings, and enjoyed themselves in that place. Mian Niamat Khan Sadarang often honored the gathering with his presence and increased its splendor. Then there were the Pandits, scholars of the time, those gentlemen incomparable in theoretical understanding, such as Mishra Surat Singh Pandit and Kriparam Pandit. There were the most magical voiced musicians like Kamiabai, Lalitabai, Nurbai, Chapala Sarup, Sarasrup, and so forth, all courtesans. In that delightful, flourishing mehfil, that assembly without sorrow, there gathered the exceptional ones of the time, the beautiful people of the world, and the flirtatious beloveds. With heartwarming songs and dances and lively melodies, life-enhancing music-making and heart-stealing flirtations, fire was lit from afar in the wine cups of the eager ones. Earth and time were brought together to dance, and Mars and Venus danced in the heavens. These were the great individuals in the assemblies, esteemed Kalawans like Mian Udit Sen and Rahim Sen, and blessed Qawwals like Mian Taj Khan, Jani and Ghulam Rasul, Lallu, Ghulami, Fazlu, Burhani, Burhan Khan, Jiwan Khan, Kalu, Yan Khan, Kanhi Khan, Mian Fazl Khan, and other masters like Mian Tan Parbin, Udit Khan, Chobaras Khan, and their sons. And bean players such as Mian Lal Khan, who along with his sons Nur Khan and Himmat Khan are unique in the world in this art. Qanun players such as Mian Nur Muhammad Qanun Nawaz, magical rabab players, mridangam players like Bhavanidas Tanka, Subhan Dinanath and Premanand, dholak players like Mian Baka and Tahna, all of them unparalleled in their time. Who were all these people? We readers and listeners are supposed to know exactly who they were just by their names. And their names are supposed to unleash a torrent of memories in us of musical gatherings we once attended, or maybe our fathers attended, where Bhavani Das played Pakawich to accompany Sadarang in that fable all-night performance where he sang Tansen's famous song, you know, the one where he sings, "Music is like the ocean, and from this endless entity, I could only ever drink one drop." 230 years later, we have no idea who these people were. And there are hundreds more such unremembered names in the Tazkiras, genealogies, introductions, and colophons of late Mughal writings on music. Here we drown in an ocean of musicians' names, all of whom are centuries dead and nearly all long forgotten. What are we supposed to do with all these names? They were important once, and the proliferation of miniature stories telling their lives in the 18th and early 19th centuries has much to tell us, not least because musicians' genealogies and anecdotes about great masters remain central to the transmission of Hindustani music to this very day. And so today I'm going to remember these names by looking at the genre in which their lives rise to the surface in the voices of their own disciples and patrons, and sometimes in their own voices, the Tazkira, or biographical collection, and other places in which musicians' names and their lineages were recorded. I want to explore what the musical Tazkira was and what it did for Hindustani music and musicians in the rough century of transition between Mughal and British rule, 1753 to 1858. Through the story, selected Tazkiras and genealogies tell of mid-18th century rivalry between the two main dynasties of imperial Kalawans, the families of the joint chief musicians of the Mughal atelier during the time of Muhammad Shah. We've already met these two musicians in passing, the masters of the Kalawans, or artists, Mian Firoz Khan Adarang on the left, and Anjabaris Khan, and we don't have a picture of him. Both were pivotal musical figures at Muhammad Shah's court. Both left his service in the aftermath of what Tazkira writer Ziauddin called the scattering of Shahjahanabad, and both died in the 1760s. But Adarang is still revered today, while Anjabaris is almost entirely forgotten. A study of musical biographies and genealogies enables us to reflect on who gets remembered, who gets forgotten, and why. But first, a few words on what a Tazkira is in general, and then on Tazkiras of musicians in late Mughal India. The Tazkira, meaning remembrance or memory, is a major and very old genre of Persian literature and later other languages like Urdu that is understood as generally factual in nature. At root, each Tazkira is a collection of short biographies that tell the individual life stories of a particular set of people, chosen by the author according to a personal or collective logic as to who was worthy of remembrance. Tazkiras are usually concerned with a particular category of people, most commonly poets or Sufis, but also noblemen, artists, or indeed the noteworthy inhabitants of a particular city. Tazkiras may be organized along different lines, alphabetically, chronologically, regionally, by gender, by religious order or occupation, and they are frequently our major sources for historical individuals, not merely concerning the facts of their lives and their networks, but more importantly about the conceptual universe, social habitus, and values of the community made up of the individuals being remembered and of those remembering them through writing. A great deal of sophisticated work has been done on this complex genre in literature and religious studies, but almost nothing has been done on the Tazkiras of Hindustani musicians. So today I'm really just opening the gates onto vast terrain. From the late 16th century, highly theorized performance practices at the Mughal court based on melodic modes called rags, became the exclusive and closely guarded property of multi-generational hereditary guilds built upon households of male professional musicians and their disciples, which included female courtesans. By the 1660s and 70s, Mughal theorists classified Indian musicians into a set of distinctive social groups possessing unique musical inheritances, but explicitly separated from what the author of the Tofar al-Hind, The Gift of India, called the respectable classes. They were not regarded as respectable. Because of their highly admired abilities, musicians' names and anecdotes were frequently written into Mughal literature. But it was the act of remembering selected individuals in a concerted way from the mid-17th century onwards, through short genealogies and later tazkiras, that established those individuals as a class. In this case, the classes of musicians considered elite and worthy of Mughal courtly patronage. Mughal writers in the 1650s through 70s singled out 4 communities they considered worthy to admit to the most exclusive, intimate gathering for musical patrons, called the Majlis or Mehfil, both of which mean assembly. These were Kalawans, who sang and composed the Drupad genre and played the been, which is that instrument you can see there, which is a stick with 2 gourds. Qawwals, singer of Sufi genres, so the Islamic mystical tradition, who in courtly assemblies sang a virtuosic song genre called khayal. Their instrumental accompanists, including dhadis and pakavich players, pakavich being a drum, and powerful female courtesans who came from a number of communities, and male dancers like Takli Bhagat, who we can see there in the middle in pink, were also patronized in a similar role from time to time. And we can come back to this painting at some point because it's fun. The 1593 Akbarnama, Chronicle of the Emperor Akbar, included a list of the names of musicians in the imperial atelier, including the community, for example, Kalawant, city of origin, Tansen of Gwalior, and biological relationships, Bilas, son of Tansen. The official chronicle of Shah Jahan's reign, the Padishahnama, or Chronicle of the Emperor, went further and included descriptions of key Kalawans and Qawwals and the genres they specialized in. Then, in 1666, nobleman and theorist Faqirullah included an original tazkira, largely of musicians he'd personally heard, as the last chapter of his treatise, the Rag Darpan, or Mirror of Rag. This section was largely ignored, despite the huge popularity of his treatise. It was not quoted again until the 1860s. It wasn't until 1753, hard on the heels of the first tazkiras of Urdu poets, that Rasik composed the first standalone treatise on the lives of Hindustani musicians. His Risala treatise was qualitatively different from what had come before. It openly cited sources like the Padishahnama and acted as what Hermansen and Lawrence call a memorative communication, connecting past with present generations, as in Anoop's fantasy Mehfil that we saw before, and also giving contemporary music lovers a sense of community with each other. Rasik's Risala remembered the great musicians and assemblies of the past in order to console present generations who were worried that the Mughal culture these musicians had helped build, still basically intact in 1753, was endangered by the instability of the times, which it was. From that point onward, there was a comparative rush of musical tazkiras and extended genealogies, at least 10 written between 1750 and 1850, generally as sections of larger works, with many, but not all of them, drawing on Rasik's tazkira. In what follows, I'm going to trace the rivalry between the musician who is remembered, Firoz Khan Adarang, and the musician who has been forgotten, Anjubanas Khan, through a small number of tazkiras and genealogies mostly written between 1740 and 1788. The Maraq-e Dehli, or Delhi album, the last 2 entries in the Khulasat al-Ish, manuscript 585 in the Edinburgh University Library, and particularly Ziauddin's Hay al-Arwah, the Ever-Living Spirits, which is in the John Rylands Library in Manchester. But before moving on, a little bit on how they work as a genre. I've taken several tazkiras, and this is the list, which use Rasik as a source in some way and compared them. I've also been cross-referencing information found in these with unrelated tazkiras and genealogies. What I want to highlight is this, using this rather terrifying slide. The list on the left from Nayak Baiju down to Niamat Khan Sadarang, is the entire contents of Rasik's Tazkira. It's organized loosely chronologically, with pre-Mughal legends above Tansen, musicians roughly of Tansen's time, then musicians of Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb's time in living memory of the present generation's father. Excuse me a minute, I've got too many pages here, hang on. Here we go. Sorry, grandparents, not father, finishing with 18th century musicians who passed away before the end of Muhammad Shah's reign. As later authors drew upon or cited Rasik's work, which is the next four lists left to right, they added entries to update the biographies to the present, but also took some away. The big losers were the vaguely remembered legends from before the middle of the 17th century. Prominent exceptions were founder fathers Nayak Gopal and Amir Khusro, and the main lineage of Mughal chief musicians descending from Tansen, because these extended into the present day of all of these authors in an unbroken line. Clearly, legends of the past didn't matter to these later authors. What mattered was recording the names of the great of the present for posterity and connecting them back to the glorious heritage of previous eras. This earnest attempt to immortalize the immediate past and present in the light of a very uncertain future is particularly obvious in the case of Ziauddin's 1785-88 Hayal Arwah, which is the right-hand list. With his frequent listeners, it is sometimes since we saw or heard of X, and we don't know if Y is dead or alive. Ziauddin was a well-connected Mughal official from Delhi, and crucially, for what is coming next, a musical disciple of Anjabaraz Khan. But he was writing from Patna in the late 1780s, where he had eventually settled after escaping what he repeatedly called the scattering of Shahjahanabad, when the Afghan warlord Ahmad Shah Abdali invaded in 1761. In the intervening years, he had lived in Faizabad in Awadh, travelled frequently to Lucknow and back to Delhi, and he also actively sought out news from travellers, arriving in Patna from places between Delhi and Bengal. While Ziauddin didn't much cite Rasik directly, he did use his name order, and he did something interesting with it. Rather than organising chronologically, he explicitly broke up Rasik's list and arranged the entries into four social categories: legendary founders, followed by Kalawans, Qawwals, and finally, gentlemen amateurs. Into these last three categories, he added dozens of entries on musicians who were active in Muhammad Shah's Delhi or were their sons or grandsons, but who had scattered to the four winds during the scattering of the 50s and 60s. Musicians' tazkiras and genealogies thus have distinctively different flavors, depending on the concerns of their authors. Rasik's tazkira, written from Delhi just before everything went horribly wrong, has the feel of a man surveying an ocean crowd from the vantage point of the journey's end. Ziauddin's Hayal Arwah feels much more like a man trying desperately to contain a torrent of rushing floodwater in a sieve. Finally, the genealogies of the Baz Khan and Sadarang lineages, found in Edinburgh 585 and the introduction to Anoop's Rag Darshan and Himmat Khan's Asal al-Usul, the foundations of rhythm, are more concerned with mapping a particular watercourse belonging to the author's family, thus ensuring that it continues to flow despite fate's attempt to divert or disperse it. So let us now consider the one who is remembered and the one who has been forgotten. I will start with the one who is remembered on the left, Feroz Khan Adarang, because his footprints in the tazkiras are curiously light, indeed absent altogether from Ziauddin's otherwise most painstaking recollections. Adarang was the nephew and chief disciple of the greatest musician of the 18th century, Sadarang, who died in 1746. He was the last Sadarang musician memorialized in Rasik's tazkira, and the first and longest entry in Darga Quli Khan's 1740 album of Delhi's finest contemporary musicians, dancers, and beauties, male and female. There are all sorts of legends about Sadarang, but I'll stick to the stories told of him in his own century. Born in Aurangzeb's reign, Sadarang came from one of the prestigious Delhi Kalawant lineages that serves the Mughal court. In the late 17th century, he got his start under the patronage of renowned music lover and songwriter Prince Muhammad Azam Shah, Aurangzeb's third son, but he made his eternal mark on music history in the time of Muhammad Shah. As a Kalawan, Sadarang had been trained in the traditions exclusive to his lineage, composing and singing the Drupad song genre and playing the bean. On hearing him play in 1740, Dargah Quli Khan sighed, "Just as the singers of this gathering steal hearts. When his hand strikes his instrument, his fingernails scratch my heart." But now Sadarang reappeared as a composer of the Khayal genre, which had until then been the exclusive property of the Qawwals of Delhi, and which he'd learned as a child from one Nisar or Tatar Khan Qawwal. Khayal had in fact been popular at court since at least the 1660s, but Sadarang's compositions and new style were so innovative and widely applauded that he has been credited in modern times with Khayal's invention. He was the greatest virtuoso and innovator of the early modern age, and many of his songs are still sung today. I could go on, but Sadarang is not the subject of my story, except that lineage is everything in Hindustani music, and musicians are nothing without lineage. Adarang was the son of Sadarang's brother, the singer and bean player Bhumar Khan, but he was so talented that Sadarang took him on personally as his chief disciple, married him to one of his daughters, and trained him in bean playing and song composition. Adarang first appears nameless in Dargah Quli Khan's album as another critically important innovator, the first musician known to have adapted courtly rag music to a new instrument, the all-famous sitar. He was also famed as a bean player, a major composer of songs, and unique, special, matchless, virtuous, and kind, spending his life in poverty and the garb of a mystic. Dargah Quli Khan attended a number of Adarang's famous all-night musical assemblies in Delhi and breathlessly recalled his incomparable musical talents. But Adarang was also important institutionally. Together with Anja Baras Khan, Adarang was the head of the Imperial Musicians' Atelier at Muhammad Shah's court. And that's all the Persian Tazkiras tell us about him. In one, his entry is less than a line long. Everything else we know about his remaining life story comes instead from his music, from the longevity of his famous Firoz Khani sitar style, which is still played, and those of his songs that were written down at the time or still remain in the repertoire. From his compositions, we know Adarang retained his position as chief musician right through the reign of Alamgir II, who died in 1759. But when his successor Shah Alam was forced into exile, Adarang fled east to Rohilkhand and found refuge with Rohilla leader Sadullah Khan, probably dying sometime in the late 1760s. Revered at the time, Adarang is still remembered today. His voice and his name live on in the performances of modern sitar, sarod, and khayal performers. Posterity has not been so kind to Muhammad Shah's other chief musician, Anja Baras Khan, Muhammad Shahi. Today, he is forgotten by all but a tiny handful of the most dedicated collectors of Drupad songs. Even by 1845, the author of an encyclopedia for the last Nawab of Lucknow could barely remember his basic details. "It's not clear," he wrote, "which family Anja Baras belonged to, but he was related to the Kalawans." The irony of that is that he was the senior representative at Muhammad Shah's court of the most prestigious lineage of Mughal imperial Kalawans, the direct father-to-son lineage of Tansen, and of the chief musicians to the Mughal emperors. Tansen's great-grandson, Khoshal Khan Gunasamudra, here in pink on the left, and Anja Baras inherited Tansen's hereditary place on the carpet in front of the Mughal throne. Muhammad Shah gave him the titles Sara Paras and Chun Paras, the complete and choicest touchstones of music. He had such a beautiful soul and mind that everyone, men and women, fell in love with him, remembered Ziauddin. He was unique in his proficiency in music. Whoever heard his Drupads were convinced that it was magical the way he combined the essence of the rag with perfect lyrics and elegant vocal improvisations to produce a beneficial effect on the mind. An unnamed relative wrote in 1788 that Anja Baras was the Sultan of the realms of singing, a master of the ways of Tansen, God bless him. He was the Tansen of his time. Was he? The simple fact is that as accomplished, well-trained and well-placed as he was, Anjabaras was unfortunate to be eclipsed in his own lifetime, first by his older rival Sadarang and then by his contemporary Adarang. We don't need the following snarky little comment from our 1845 commentator to know that all was not entirely breezy in the house of Tansen. Anjabaras aspired to be given the title of second Tansen by Muhammad Shah, but since Niamat Khan Sadarang was more accomplished than he was, the king's approval went to Sadarang and Anjabaras remained unacknowledged. This last statement is not true. Anjabaras and his nephews were all official members of the emperor's atelier, permitted to use the title Muhammad Shahi. But there can only be one Tansen at a time. And once you start looking at the tazkiras and genealogies written by junior members of Anjabaras Khan's own lineage, especially Ziauddin's Hay al-Arwah, anxiety, envy, and defensiveness begin to seep out everywhere. For one thing, it must have been both an honor and somewhat galling for Anjabaras Khan, the son of Tansen's house, to be married off to Sadarang's daughter. Yes, the two major lineages were joined together in a dynastic marriage to shore up both families' survival sometime in the middle of the century. We know he did feel it was an honor to be brought into Sadarang's family and thus become privy to its innovative musical secrets because his devoted disciple Ziauddin said so. But by becoming Sadarang's disciple, Anjabaras was subordinating his far older traditions to the upstart and rather flashy traditions of Sadarang's family, and was also forced into a slightly lower status within the family to Adarang, who was also son-in-law and special disciple, and Anjabaras's main rival. Ziauddin includes a lovely little anecdote that illustrates Anjabaras's secretly wounded pride over being superseded. Having been accepted into the Sadarang family by marriage, he took on one of Sadarang's other nephews, Fazl Khan, circled there in red, as a student. Fazl played in the style particular to the Kandari branch of the Kalawan lineage, that is, the branch represented by Sadarang's line. But when he went to learn with Anjabaras made Fazl write a note of agreement, a muchalka, stating that Fazl's forefathers had no musical integrity and were servants of Anjabaras Khan's lineage. He sweetened this a little by reassuring his new student, "He who makes himself a servant shall in turn become master." Fazl Khan took this on the chin, as a loyal disciple must, and in due course, Fazl did indeed become a senior performer, basing himself in Benares, where he died sometime after 1780. Rivalry between musicians is standard fodder in Hindustani musical anecdotes, and in happier times, this level of competition would not have mattered. But after Nadir Shah's looting of the Mughal treasury in 1739, the Mughal emperor could sustain only so many musicians, and competition was rather closer to a matter of life and death. And there is indeed evidence that the instability at court after this point knocked Anjabaras off course, as it eventually did his great rival Adarang too. Dargah Quli Khan and Ziauddin, who were both eyewitnesses, said that Muhammad Shah released a number of his best musicians after the Persian Emperor Nadir Shah's incursion, whether out of grief, lack of funds, or both. In Anjabaras Khan's case, the nobleman, Amir Khan, requested the emperor's permission to put Anjabaras on his staff at a salary of 300 rupees and take him and a number of other musicians with him to Allahabad, where he was being sent as governor. When the governor returned to Delhi in 1744, Anjabaras came with him, shortly after which he apparently went into retirement, remaining in Delhi throughout the forthcoming invasions, massacres, looting, and wars until his death about 1764, 5 years into the reign of Shah Alam. In another telling story of the supposed decline of contemporary morals, Ziauddin pits a particularly unworthy rival against his hero to provide justification of his so-called retirement from performing in Delhi. The musician in question was Shujat Khan, another court Qalawant, but a rather fruity character. Dargah Quli Khan was especially contemptuous of Shujat's vanity and presumption, and the implication is lack of talent. Here's Ziauddin on the fateful event. When Anjabaras was summoned to return from Allahabad to the Emperor Muhammad Shah's presence in Shahjahanabad, a musical assembly was held at a private house. Permission was granted to the musicians of Delhi that each of the groups from the different branches of the Kalawats should perform in turn. When it was Shujat's turn, who was known ironically as Lord Shujat, he asked Mian Anjabaras permission to sing, insisting that, as you are the chief of our community, you must perform first. Anjabaras declined, saying, "It's of no consequence, Mian Shujat. You perform first." Shujat Khan replied sarcastically, "Mian Sab, I don't know any performing. If you ask me to go first, I will just perform a couple of seductive winks and then get up." The governor sniggered at what Shujat had said. Because Mian Anjabaras was a wise and serious person and of a most honourable and independent bent, he left the gathering at once and not only ceased his friendship with Amir Khan, the governor, but left behind all worldly things and became a Sufi. He never again went to the houses of rich people to perform music. When Emperor Ahmad Shah celebrated the 3rd anniversary of his enthronement in 1750-51, he was asked once more to come before the emperor. The emperor asked him, "Are you Anjabaras Khan, whom my father Muhammad Shah described to me?" He replied, "That Anjabaras has passed away, and this Anjabaras is another person who has come into your presence." The king ordered him to sing and improvise something. Then they say that the king said to him, "I will give you anything you want." Anjabaras replied, "It is my greatest wish not to be asked to come into your presence again." This was genuinely because he had become a companion of the dervishes, the Sufis. Anjabaras clearly was a devoted Sufi. From the beginning, he'd found a place at the feet of the mystical poet Shah Gulshan, who was also a leader of the Naqshbandi order in Delhi. He was also a regular attendee of the poetry gatherings held at the house of great Delhi intellectual Arzu, which is where he met Ziauddin and agreed to take him on as a disciple if he gave him a copy of Rumi's Masnavi. And Sufi institutions in Delhi do seem to have been places of long-term refuge for musicians who remained throughout the turmoil and scattering of the 1750s and 60s, as several other of Ziauddin's biographies attest. But Anjabaras seems also to have found the overwhelming rise to dominance of Khayal at the expense of the ancient Drupad traditions of Tansen thoroughly disheartening. In this final anecdote, Ziauddin, with clear discomfort, reflects his master's disdain for one of the greatest Khayal singers of the day, the Qawwal, Sheikh Moinuddin, whose grandfather, Sheikh Sher Muhammad, had introduced Khayal for the first time into Shah Jahan's court. Jaga Quli Khan remembered Moinuddin as the master of the age, unique in the arts of Qawwali and especially Khayal. The proliferation of his melodies is beyond reckoning, like the flowers of the gardens of Kashmir. With the colour of Bizard's brush, he paints pictures with his music on the surface of the wind. Anjabaras' view of the man was not so flattering. And I quote, "Sheikh Moinuddin was so powerful in his singing that when he started a musical performance, he would sing one khayal in several ragas, one after the other, without any sign of strain. One day I asked Anjabaras his opinion about composing and performing khayal in several rags. He answered that composing in several rags is raschandi, mixing your moods, and that it would be better just to perform it correctly in one rag. He went on to say that some Kalawats perform in a specific way where a drupad is sung continuously in a single session in several rags, a practice that is called rag sagar, or ocean of rag. But it is unpleasant to listen to." Nonetheless, Sheikh Moinuddin performed in this style and handled raschandi very well. I don't know enough about music to evaluate the Sheikh on the basis of Mian Anjabaras' statement, but it is sufficient to know that in performing khayal, no qawwal has ever reached his status." Unquote. While Adarang retained his place in the firmament of Hindustani musical stars because of his virtuosity as a performer and the ongoing appeal of his musical compositions, Anjabaras clearly found his real place in music history during the 20 years or so of his retirement as a sought-after teacher and transmitter of the traditions of both the Baras Khan and Sadarang branches of the Delhi Kalawats. Ziauddin names at least 8 students who were unrelated to him, though his principal disciples were from within his own lineage, his great-nephew Muzaffar Khan and the celebrated Karim Sen. That difference in roles, I think, virtuoso performer versus expert teacher, to a large extent determined that Adarang would be remembered and Anjabaras forgotten. It is fitting that it was one of his students, Ziauddin, who ensured that more than 2 centuries down the line, I would pick up what he wrote about his teacher and remember him this evening. It remains for me, in conclusion, to zoom out from the details of this microhistory of 2 pivotal rivals and make some preliminary suggestions on a more macro level as to what we can make of the rivalries Ziauddin tried so hard to construe in his master's favour, but also of the sheer detail attached to all those names. The 2 things I want to draw attention to, geographies and lineages, are neatly encapsulated in the paragraph from Anoop's introduction to the Rag Darshan that I quoted at the beginning, which I have reversed here. Because of their eminence in this unique science, they were honoured attendants upon Emperor Muhammad Shah, but due to the changing fortunes of the time and the collapse of the Sultanate, Khushal Khan with the late Karim Khan came to Hyderabad, and Karim Khan was the special disciple of Mian Adarang, who was himself the special disciple of the reigning prince of music, Mian Niamat Khan Sadarang, whose status in the science of music is brighter than the sun and goes without saying. Firstly, the big expansion in the writing of Hindustani musicians' biographies and genealogies after 1750 was paralleled in a dramatic upsurge in India of poetical tazkira production at the same time, the 2nd and 3rd quarters of the 18th century. The answer to the why question, why does the recording of all these names and lives become so important to writing on music in late Mughal India, concerns the need to preserve intact the memory of historical traditions and to keep track of contemporary musical developments in a situation of considerable geopolitical upheaval, where musicians and patrons were on the move in unprecedented numbers. Expert traditions that largely rely on embodied oral and oral knowledge for their transmission, like those of Afghanistan today, are uniquely vulnerable when the physical bodies of musicians and listeners are themselves under threat. Unlike the poetical tazkiras, the musical tazkiras don't preserve the lyrics that were composed or sung by its protagonists. These were hived off into a separate genre, which newly proliferated in the same period, the song collection. But what tazkiras do preserve is the traces of musicians and patrons' movements and the reasons why they moved. Nadir Shah's invasion was largely swatted away like a fly. The real trouble seems to have started when Prime Minister Safdarjung fell out with Ahmad Shah in 1754, worsened through Alamgir II's reign, and came to a peak of intolerability with the scattering of the people of Shahjahanabad. Firstly, the exile of Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II from Delhi between 1759 and 72, taking a tiny nucleus of his favourite musicians with him to Allahabad, including Qanun player Nur Muhammad and Adarang's brother, the bean player Lal Khan, and his young sons, Nur and Hemant Khan. But most forcefully, the sacking and seizure of Delhi by Ahmad Shah Abdali after the Battle of Panipat in 1761. It seems to have been the Mughal emperor's enforced absence from Delhi that knocked the musical stuffing out of it. Obviously, the scattering was an exaggeration. By no means everyone left. But those with significant talent or prospects do mostly seem to have gone elsewhere in a hurry, even if they returned to Delhi later. Let's just take Anjabaris's students. His great-nephew, Muzaffar Khan, ended up in Lucknow, working for the ruler, Asaf-ud-Dawla. Another disciple, Karim Sen, went to the court of Kathmandu in Nepal. Sadarang's nephew, Fazil, became a star fixture in British-run Benares. Qaval Muhammad Panar went to work for Asaf-ud-Dawla's estranged brother Sadat Ali Khan, who was in the entourage of the Mughal Emperor's general Najaf Khan, while his son, Ghulam Raza, went to Faizabad, and his grandson took up residence in Patna. Ziauddin himself went first to Faizabad, then made his way to Patna, and while Anjabar stayed in Delhi throughout, Adarang and Sheikh Moinuddin both went to Rohilkhand. For many other musicians, Lucknow was a particular draw, but plenty also went to Benares and Patna, further afield to Murshidabad, and even tiny places that employed musicians for religious reasons, like Mathura. But the reasons Ziauddin seemed to have mapped these movements in such detail and urgency is revealed in the many small asides about people he knew who can no longer be traced. When the Pakhavich player Chabar Khan left Delhi, he first went to Patna. Ziauddin wrote, It is nearly 20 years ago now that he came to my house for the music and poetry gatherings that were held every month. He went to the court of Murshidabad some years since, but nothing has been heard of him or the other Kalawans there for some time now. I don't think I need to explain further the poignancy of that. But this urgency to document itineraries does sketch out a neat map of the major late 18th century's musical centres, of musical culture. And it also explains the anxiety bubbling just under the surface of Ziauddin's remembrances of his own master. There was still plenty of money in Hindustan and plenty of patrons still who wanted to hear the best music the Mughal court could offer. That money, that prestige, that authority, all those names had once been concentrated at Muhammad Shah's court. But it was, within a short period of time, suddenly all on the move, accompanied by significant risks to life and limb. That meant musicians not only had to move, but they had to be willing to adapt to new fashions or tastes in the places they moved to, or find another way to survive. While Anju Burris seems to have been willing to learn the Khayal style of Sadarang, who at least was a Kalawan, he was unwilling to compromise his ancient family traditions by singing like a Qawwal, even one as universally acclaimed as Sheikh Moinuddin. What he did have to offer as a teacher was a distinctive product, a taste of the authentic traditions of the Mughal Golden Age, which would still have delighted a number of potential patrons. For the other things these tazkiras and genealogies underline is the importance of verifiable lineage through the name of your father or teacher and your possession of musical materials unique to his lineage as proof to new patrons that you were who you said you were and therefore knew what you were doing. As Edinburgh 585 shows, remembering names and how they were connected was also important knowledge within lineages because names acted as triggers to remember family musical materials that, in the absence of a detailed written notation system, were subject to loss at the best of times. But in the absence of the proximate embodied knowledge of extended families living together in one place, were now threatened with extinction. This is why they were written down. Rivalry between lineages rose to the surface when the survival of a particular lineage was seriously at stake. But in fact, most of the time, Ziauddin and other writers of this period both made lineages distinct through differentiating their musical styles and personnel, and embraced those different lineages, if they were good and worthy of embracing, as equally valuable. Thus, Ziauddin, the gentleman student of a Kalawant, went out of his way to describe the life histories of Qawwals separately, but with equal enthusiasm and respect. He also drew attention to the clear difference between the styles of two separate Kalawant lineages in his rice story about Fazl Khan's apprenticeship to Anju Burris. Indeed, it is in these late Mughal texts that the four Kalawant family styles called Banis start being named and described as distinctive in some melodic and rhythmic detail. It's worth reminding ourselves in conclusion of the birth of today's gharanas, or household guilds, in the searing aftermath of the 1857 uprising, in urgent response to another violent political watershed in which musicians died and were forced into exile and scattered to the winds. This slide shows Jim Kippen's summary of Daniel Newman's analysis of what a Hindustani musical lineage must possess to qualify as a gharana today. These elements must also be backed up by oral histories of the family's genealogy and anecdotes about elite patrons, famous ancestors, and of course, infamous rivalries. The musical tazkiras and genealogies of late Mughal writers demonstrate that every single one of these ingredients were already present and prized in the social configurations of hereditary musicians in the 18th century and even earlier, even though they weren't called gharanas until the 1860s. And that bewilderment of names in the introduction to the 1798 Khulasa-ul-Ish, who were all those people? Of the 40 unremembered names I read out at the beginning, brief life histories of 25 of them are found in the writings of the biographers and genealogists we've been keeping company with today. They were important once. We have remembered them once again. Thank you.
you so much, Catherine, for just a terrific, wide-ranging, informative seminar. Introducing us, what really struck me was the links there between lineage, authority, music, and the way that that was shaped over the time. I invite questions now.
And there are no silly questions because I'm aware that this material is going to be new to everybody.
I'd like to get the ball rolling with questions, please. Katherine, first of all, I'd just like to congratulate you on a wonderful, wonderful paper. You've really brought that whole that time and that culture to life, and it's something that very few of us really know very much about. So I'd like to warmly congratulate you on a wonderful piece of work, and I'm really looking forward to seeing your book on Friday. I think, is that right?
Yes, so it should be out on Friday on ebook, and then the stock of the hardback will be coming out later.
Wonderful. Okay, then. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your sources, please. Can you tell us where are you finding these biographies? What collections are they in? How difficult are they to access?
Yeah,
please.
Sure. Okay. So I mean, one of the premises of the book actually is to point out that that Hindustani musicians were not illiterate, as has been widely assumed since the late 19th century. And because there's been this assumption that Hindustani musicians were illiterate and passed everything on, what they say, sina pa sina, so person to person, there just aren't any sources. And it turns out that just simply isn't the case. And all I did was look in library catalogues. So that most of my sources are in Persian, and there are some in Braj Bhasha and later on in Urdu. Braj Bhasha being the classical form of Hindi, and the ones that I've been using are actually written in the Persian script rather than in Devanagari, the script that you might be more familiar with Hindi and Sanskrit, a lot of them are in places like the British Library and in the Royal Asiatic Society, but there are major collections of these in places like the Khuda Bakhsh Oriental Public Library in Patna, the Salajang Museum in Hyderabad, the Raza Library in Rampur, in Delhi, Aligarh Muslim University, Calcutta, in the National Library, and in the Asiatic Society of Bengal. There, the government museum. The University of Madras, the Government Oriental Manuscript Library, Punjab University Library in Lahore. So, and all over really, and others, sort of come to light all the time. The one with the beautiful painting of that sort of fantasy musical gathering with all these kind of musicians from different time periods all playing and singing together, is in the University of Pennsylvania Library now, and available to view free of charge, open access.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. I wonder if our participants might have some questions for Katherine. If you have a question, you could put your hand up, please, or you could click on the Q&A. Other questions, please, from our audience.
Well, while people are thinking, I have a question, if I may. Yeah, I was really struck by the masculine culture of the musical courts that you're talking about, and you mentioned it near the start of the paper about the role of the courtesan, and I'm just wondering a little bit more about what was the cultural role of the courtesan in these musical cultures, and were they involved in performance or composition or other forms of music than the rags in some way?
Yeah, so courtesans were enormously important, and I've written about this. There's an article in Gender and History about 10 years ago called The Courtesan Tale, where I write about the stories that get told about courtesans and the fact that they're basically identical in form, because it's actually a cautionary tale. But we've got lots more information than just those kind of prescriptive stories. They were enormously important. They were highly educated, highly trained, both in singing and in dance. And certain they came from largely matrilineal communities, which have now become known as castes, and there's dozens of them, and the most elite were invited to perform in these male only spaces. So this is a completely gender segregated society, not just the Muslims, but also the elite Hindus as well. So you had women's spaces and you had men's spaces, and completely segregated. That did not mean that the elite women didn't have incredibly important political roles. They did. One of the Mughal women was the governor of Delhi for a while, for example, from inside the harem. But courtesans were not considered to be women, if that makes sense. They were considered to be both more than and less than women. They were a unique third category. So they were able to perform in these male gatherings, and were treated as, sort of important bearers of culture. But they were not allowed to enter the harem without causing a scandal. So plenty of them did, which is how we know that they weren't supposed to. But if a man married a courtesan, that was one thing, that was a bit shocking. But if he then let her come out again and perform for his friends, that was absolutely, it was also regarded as lèse-majesté, in fact, to do that, because you're dishonoring the sort of kind of principles of segregation between men and women in the court. So, but they're hugely important. And even as late as the early 19th century, regarded even by Europeans as kind of the equivalent to an opera diva on the London stage. So somebody who might have liaisons with her patrons, but who was, sort of fated by women for her, sort of beauty and her wealth and so on. They were very wealthy.
That's nice.
So, Jenny, you've got something you would like to say. So I'm trying to promote you to panelist. Is that working, or can I just allow you to talk? Are you there, Jenny? You might unmute your mic.
Hi, Catherine. Can you hear me?
I can, Jenny. Hi.
Hi. Look, it was just, I really didn't have so much a question, but I'm just so fascinated with your lecture. It's absolutely wonderful. Thank you. I love India and I travel there, but I'm embarrassed to say I know nothing about the music. So I have a great deal to learn. So thank you very, very much. It was just excellent. And particularly as you are our last presenter for the year. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jenny. And I mean, the music's beautiful. It's, I mean, there's loads of recordings. I teach using YouTube clips, basically. If you want to listen to a rag that was actually invented at this court, there's a rag called Rag Darbari, which is Darbari. Rag Darbari. It's very beautiful. And see if you can find maybe a sarod recording, an instrumental recording of it. The vocal style is a little bit harder to kind of engage with, but that rag was said to be invented by this great musician Tansen, and when he sang another rag, the legend has it, there's this rag called Rag Deepak, which is supposed to cause fire to break out. And he sang it so perfectly that the Emperor Akbar's hall burst into flames. And his daughter rushed out and sang another rag called Rag Meg, which brings the monsoon rains to douse the fire.
How beautiful. Katherine, McComas, while I'm unmuted, I just want to send Ros Smith's sincere apologies. While you've been speaking, Ros and I have had endless emails trying for her to connect, and she wasn't able to.
Sorry.
She was at her apartment, and we've had this problem before. So, but I said to her, we have your recording, so
Yes.
you'll be able to listen to it. And I'll send you the link as soon as we have it all edited properly.
Great, brilliant.
Thank you again, Katherine. It was a great
My pleasure.
evening.
So we've got a question from Litra HB Perfumery, and I'll just allow you to talk now. So please, Mr. or Mrs. Doctor or Professor Perfumery, go ahead, please. You'll have to unmute yourself, though. Is the perfumery there? Go ahead, please. Hello, hello.
Oh, she might be gone. Hey.
Hi, am I audible?
Only just.
Just about. Yeah.
Well, my question is in the chat, actually, it's pretty transparent. I was kind of wondering how you close this gap between the objective historical scholarship with the experience of the music and the rag as it is a practice today, and how is there a way to reconcile that, or does it have to be reconciled?
Yeah, that is actually the philosophical question that I ask in the book, because I'm really interested in how we can get at experience and the experience of what it was like to be there listening to this stuff, because that's actually what it's about. That's why it matters. Why music matters is because it's the effect that it has on human beings, on our emotions, on our minds, on our collective solidarities, and so on. The kind of icon of the book is the Pietra Dura inlay of Orpheus subduing the beasts with his viola da braccio playing, which is behind Emperor Shah Jahan's head in the fort at Shahjahanabad, which you can still see. It's very defaced because after the uprising in 1857, a captain called Captain Jones, aka Jones the Avenger, tore it down from the wall and had it set into a marble top table and shipped back to his home in England, where he put cups of coffee on it. And it got returned for the coronation darbar in 1911, and placed back in position in very defaced form. But Orpheus is this kind of symbol of the power of the emperor to bring peace and harmony to the world. My question, my philosophical question is, can writing about music actually tell us what it was like to be there and experience this music? Because we don't have the sounds; they're all gone. The writing system, there is a notation system, but it's not used for the purposes that, say, a Beethoven symphony, was used for. So it's very difficult to get at the sounds, except in some limited instances. But we also don't listen with the same ears anymore. We're not listening in the same spaces. We're not sitting in a room in a Delhi winter, surrounded by furs and tapestries and pashminas and so on, and listening to a sort of slightly muffled but echoed stone, surrounding with companions who have been, doing this over and over again. So the question is, can Orpheus bring Eurydice back from the dead? So can writing about music bring the music back, and the experience of it? And the answer is no. So,
we're really running out of time, but we've got time for just one more question. Yeah. So Chandani Jaswal, would you go ahead, please?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Schofield, for this lecture. I wanted to ask, ma'am, that when Hindustani music, let's say, traveled to the northern part of India, somewhere, let's say in Punjab, did it acquire any regional variation, or was Hindustani music heard just as is, if at all it traveled to other parts of India apart from Delhi and its vicinity?
Yes, so and particularly in the 18th century, because musicians were sort of needing to adapt their styles to different tastes, they would perform what their patrons wanted them to perform. But it's also, it's also important to remember that Delhi, after 1857, was subsumed in Punjab. It's right on the border with Punjab, and it was kind of lumped in. The British lumped it in with Punjab, so it's very close to Punjab, and there were Punjabi genres already that had been gentrified and come into the canon. So that, particularly thinking of the genre tappa, which was regarded as a type of khayal in the 17th century. And it's sung in Punjabi, and it's supposed to kind of mimic, sort of the love songs sung by camel drivers in Punjab. But it leaves Delhi with 3 Qawwal brothers, one of whom has a son called Ghulam Nabi Shori, a man called Mian Shori. And Mian Shori is famous in Lucknow because when they went to Lucknow and set up there, he developed tappa into a genre of its own. And what he did with it was he, rather than just singing it in Punjabi, he's famous for having written tappas in Kashmiri, Urdu, Persian, a whole pile of other languages. But there's also the famous courtesans Kaharwa dance, which came from Punjab. And so you have all these courtesans, itinerant courtesans coming in from Punjab and Kashmir in the 18th century and bringing with them new dance forms that then become gentrified and enter the court. And Kaharwa is one of those.
Ma'am, so if I could please follow up here.
Very briefly, please. We're really out of time. Just one sentence.
Thank you very much. Just a short follow-up. So, ma'am, if the music traveled to Punjab, it must have also traveled to the Northwest Frontier Province. And did it acquire a regional taste there?
Yes. So I know less about it, but there's all not just the Northwest Frontier Province, but also up into Afghanistan. So a lot of the and of course the Afghan Rabab also came the other way into India and then was developed into the Sarod later. So there's been full kind of interchange between the plains, if you like, Hindustan and Punjab, Northwest Frontier, Afghanistan, but also going the other way to Bengal. So Hindustani music went, lots of these musicians went to Murshidabad, they went to Calcutta, they went to Dhaka, and they took, the Hindustani ragas with them and then sang in Bengali and sort of changed the genres so that they would fit with local taste.
Thank you, ma'am. It's good to know that the Hindustani music is actually Hindustani, covering most parts of India.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Pleasure.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I think we'll leave it there. Thank you again, Katherine, for an absolutely terrific introduction survey into musical culture. And really, I'd just like to reinforce what Jenny said earlier about your talk being a model of clarity and accessibility for those of us for whom the material was very new, and we appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Great. For everybody, we'll have a recording of this seminar on the Centre for Early Modern Studies YouTube channel in the coming days, and keep an eye out next year for future events. Thank you and bye.